Well, this morning's sermon is on Unitarian Universalism and spiritual growth, and is it possible, and what do we mean by that? And I understood that our forum this morning could be maybe a model of our spiritual growth. There was an attempt to define religion, and how did that go? Could not define religion in a group, which I think may be typical for us Unitarian Universalists. But again, what do we do for our own spiritual growth? And what I want to focus on with that question today is, how does our history and how does history in general affect us, and can we use our history and our faith tradition to help us in our spiritual journey? And I really like the words in our reading to be kind of a subtext for the sermon, and these words are what I would pull out. And our spiritual growth would move us to a greater fullness of ourselves and a greater fullness and participation with our society. And in that sense of fullness, the words go, since fullness implies widening into space, implies still further widening, implies widening until the circle is whole. And rather than see spiritual growth and spirituality come to a point or come to a particular set of beliefs, this view of spiritual growth and spirituality is about gaining the fullness of what it means to be human and has a greater wideness to it, which may seem kind of different, because usually, especially sometimes in meditation, you pick a point to focus on and you use that point to help you meditate. But I think we're going to go for a fullness and a widening of who we are as humans in this context. But then we ask the question, how do we participate in history? How do we participate in our faith tradition? Does being in a faith tradition mean I'm willing to change? Does being in a faith tradition mean I need to conform to the faith tradition? Does being in a faith tradition mean I need to be aware of that faith tradition? I was speaking at a Unitarian Universalist church last week, and I brought up the name William Ellery Channing, who's the founder of Unitarianism in our country, and I had people come up to me afterwards saying, well, we never heard that name before. We didn't know who that was. And rather than say there's something going on there, I'm going to say I did a poor introduction in the sermon of communicating who he was, because I made the assumption that we would know. I made that assumption. And I think that was clearly wrong. But it moves us to the question, if we claim that we are in a faith tradition, and we want to use that faith tradition to help us grow and to help us nurture our spirituality, then how are we to relate to that faith tradition? And the only way that we can understand that is to read the story of that faith tradition. And we persons, humans, we are storied creatures. We live in story, and we move from story to story, maybe, or our story evolves, maybe, or our story widens, maybe. Why in story formation in our culture today, in the political arena, why does it seem like the story that, say, Glenn Beck promotes gets more attention than the story that Dennis Kucinich promotes? Why one story, why one myth gets this intense emotional attachment and not another? And as far as our faith tradition, why should we pay attention to historical figures? Do we pay attention to historical figures to gain knowledge? To read their writings, and now that we know more about them and it kind of stays out here, do we pay attention to historical figures for entertainment? Do we pay attention to historical figures to say, yes, this person is in my historical faith. So when I'm in a group of people claiming the founders of this country and their faith tradition. I can say, oh no, Jefferson and Adams were really Unitarians and they're in our faith tradition. So I know enough about my faith tradition that I can argue with people and say, no, this is true about us. So do I use it as ammunition? What do I do with the information? Do I read our history? Do I read our text to challenge myself? Do I read the history that I come from, not only to know it, but to actually engage it and participate in that story and take the values that those people fought for and the traditions that they created to participate in those traditions and those values today? Do I read that to encourage me and to strengthen me? And goodness knows, if we are moderate, moving to the left in our theology and our thinking, heard a new term. I had to say, I wasn't going to say it, but I've got to say it. Got to try to always attempt to put us in present historical context. The new term was liberal Republican. On television, I heard it. Well, anytime we live in a narrative, and anytime we live in a story, and anytime we think we have a grasp on something, and we understand story through story, one story interprets another story, and when we hear a new term, we should raise a flag up. Because when we hear a new term, somebody's trying to introduce a new theme. Somebody's trying to introduce a new script. Somebody's trying to manipulate or propagandize or educate or illuminate. Somebody's trying to do something with that new term. So whenever we hear a new term, we want to understand it. And so when I hear the term such as liberal Republican, because I've been listening to one side, liberals good, freedom, liberty, movement. Along that side, liberals are bad, socialist along that side. But now all of a sudden here's this camp that uses the word Republican, good or bad, I'm not saying that, but here's this camp that uses this word, that now within that camp there's a dividing line. You are that and I am this. So we ask ourselves, what is that about? It is certainly not a unifying term. It is certainly not the integration of a theme that says, we are all in a difficult situation and we need to join together to come through this difficult situation to help this nation out. It's not a term that does that. It's a term that divides. So we want to pay attention to that. Something else I want to introduce and talk a bit about today before we get into some of the heart of the actual words and teachings of William Ellery Channing, one of the founders of Unitarianism in the United States of America, in our country, in the early 19th century, 1810, 1830, 40s. See, you learn. We can learn. We can change. It's true. That in order for us as persons and as a community and as a nation, in order for us to be full, in order for us to potentialize ourselves, I believe and would argue for the case that we need to know what historical lineage are we in. What is the conceptual historical patterns, the concepts of history, the patterns of history do I find myself in? And do I agree with them? Do I support them? Am I conscious of them? Or do I spend so much attention to a new term, liberal Republican, that I get lost in that I forget history and I just stay in kind of the here and now and I'm not familiar with the flow and the movement of history as time goes by? If I do that, then I'm going to say my potential to live within a full sense of myself is very limited. That I need to know where I come from personally and what historical narrative that I participate in. For example, in today's context, I was reading a book from, I guess it's a pamphlet called The Brain. Actually, my mother-in-law Betty gets it and I read it. And they've come to this conclusion after a study. In a new study, researchers in the University of Michigan found that college students today are about 40% lower in empathy, measured by standard personality tests, than their counterparts 20 and 30 years ago. The biggest drop occurred after 2000, coinciding with the rise of online communications and social networking. And the author sees the possible correlation. Empathy is best activated when you see another person signal for help, and if you're online, you can't see that other person's signal for help. So they're saying there's a 40% deficit of empathy. So today I'm perusing some of the news headlines, knowing that I'm going to attend to that in this place to see if there's a historical process that of a nation that reflects the lack of empathy. So that's my thought. So, the universe, God, somebody, Huffington Post, aren't they good? Because I have the idea and they deliver the article. You gotta love it. You gotta love it. Online, reducing my empathy. Okay, and the title begins a deficit of empathy. Politicians on all parties ruling our nation for the past 30 to 40 years, same amount of years that this person's talking about, are reluctant to act on poverty. And their reluctance to act on poverty, you can look at that headline and say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, poverty is at the highest level it's been in 15 years. It's 14% in 2009 of our population. But what does that mean? There's a total of 15 million children who live in poverty, which means not being fed well, not being attended well. And this person's making, when those statistics came out, what did our government do? Talk about tax cuts. Not about poverty and doing something about the problem in this nation. Okay. Now, what might that have to do with historical lineage? That here's the governing class not attending to the poor. Well, here's some words from 2,500 years ago, addressing the governing class. You oppress the poor, crush the needy. You seize house after house, and the prophets of the Old Testament. Don't believe the words of your rulers, and so forth. So here we have a governing class for over 2,500 years that relates to the poor in the same way. So that's a historical heritage, historical lineage that exists. Another one. If you have the idea that you think there should be universal health care, that you think everybody should have access to health care, okay. Well, you look back through history and you find you're on the side of Eleanor Roosevelt, you're on the side of Teddy Roosevelt, you're on the side of Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. So you're in that historical lineage when you say you want universal health care. So that's the path you would be in. Another one, just so we can get a gauge on how to think about us. If I'm a person who is, and I struggle even talking about it because I find it so abhorrent, but if you are a person who has an anti-gay mentality, in Montana, on one of the political platforms, their goal is to make homosexuality illegal. Okay, that's a here and now event. Okay, that's a statement of a here and now group of people. Is there a historical lineage that these people find themselves in, that if they knew they were in that historical lineage, would they question their particular position?